"You make this place warmer," Emma scribbled on a receipt, unaware that David, the quiet stranger at table 9, was a CEO hiding his truth. Their story unfolds in a New York cafe where small gestures spark a journey of trust, betrayal, and redemption. Before diving in, share where you're from and rate this heartfelt tale from 0 to 10 in the comments. Enjoy. The bell above the cafe door chimed, a soft metallic clink that cut through the hum of early morning chatter. Emma adjusted her apron, the worn cotton brushing her fingertips as she scanned the room. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries, warm and heavy, clinging to the walls of the small New York cafe. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray, damp day that made people linger over their mugs a little longer, their faces half hidden behind steaming cups. She moved with practiced ease, weaving between tables, balancing a tray of empty plates, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished wood floor. Her brown hair, tied back in a loose ponytail, swayed as she worked, a few strands catching the light from the window. At the counter, Lily was polishing glasses, her dark curls bouncing as she leaned forward, eyes glinting with mischief. "He's here again, you know," she said under her breath, barely moving her lips. Emma didn't need to ask who. Her gaze flicked instinctively to the corner of the room, to table 9, tucked against the window, where the city's pulse seemed to slow. There he was, David. He sat with his back to the wall, one hand resting lightly on the table, the other turning the pages of a slim paperback. His black coffee sat untouched, steam curling upward like a whispered secret. He wore a charcoal sweater, sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms lean and strong, and his dark hair fell just enough to shadow his eyes. He didn't look up, didn't scan the room, didn't fidget. He was still, like a photograph someone had forgotten to move. Emma's chest tightened, a quick, involuntary pull. She'd noticed him weeks ago, the first time he'd walked in on a rainy afternoon, his coat speckled with droplets, his presence quiet but impossible to ignore. Every Tuesday since, he'd claimed the same table, ordered the same coffee, and carried the same unreadable air. Not arrogance. Never that. It was something else, something that made her pause, like catching a melody she couldn't quite name. She didn't know his name either, not really. Just David, scribbled on the order slip, a name that felt too ordinary for the weight of his gaze. "Earth to Emma," Lily said, snapping her fingers. "You're staring again." Emma blinked, heat creeping up her neck. She busied herself with refilling a sugar jar, her fingers clumsy around the lid. "I'm not staring," she muttered, but the lie felt thin even to her. Lily smirked, leaning closer. "You say that, but your eyes are practically writing poetry over there. Why don't you just talk to him? Say something. Anything." Emma shook her head, her lips twitching into a half smile. "And say what?" "Hi. I've been watching you brood over your coffee for a month. Want to chat?" She kept her voice low, but the words carried a spark of defiance. Lily laughed, the sound bright against the clatter of dishes. "Exactly that. Or, you know, something less tragic. Come on, Emma, you're not invisible. He's got to notice you back." The idea settled in Emma's mind, like dust in sunlight, fleeting, but impossible to ignore. She wasn't invisible, not here. She knew the regulars by name, remembered their orders, their quirks. Mrs. Callahan liked her tea with 2 sugars and a splash of milk. Mr. Torres always asked for extra napkins for his grandkids. But David, he was a puzzle, a shadow that didn't fit the rhythm of the cafe. He never rushed, never complained, never left a mess. And yet every time she passed his table, her pulse betrayed her, quickening like a drumbeat she couldn't silence. The morning rush slowed, leaving a lull that felt like the world holding its breath. Emma wiped down the counter, her hands moving in steady circles, but her thoughts kept drifting to table 9. She stole another glance. David was reading now, his brow slightly furrowed, one finger tracing the edge of his book. The sight of him, so composed, so separate, stirred something in her. A curiosity sharp enough to cut through her usual caution. Lily nudged her elbow, holding out a fresh order pad. "He's due for a refill soon. Go. Be brave." Her voice was teasing but warm, like she knew Emma needed the push. Emma hesitated, her fingers curling around the pad. She wasn't bold, not really. She worked double shifts to keep the lights on at home, to make sure her mom's medical bills didn't pile up, to give her little brother, Noah, a chance at something better. Bravery was for people with room to risk. But something about David, about the way he seemed to carry his own quiet world, made her want to step into it, just for a moment. "Fine," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "If he comes back next Tuesday, I'll do something. I'll write something. On his receipt." The words slipped out before she could stop them, reckless and raw. Lily's eyes widened, a grin spreading across her face. "A love note? Emma, you wild thing. I'm holding you to it." Emma laughed, the sound catching in her throat. "It wasn't a love note, not exactly. Just a gesture, a spark to see if it caught fire. She didn't know what she expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe just the act of writing it would be enough to shake loose the knot in her chest." The bell chimed again, pulling her back to the present. Another customer, another order. But as she moved through her tasks, the idea of that note lingered. A small, dangerous promise. David stayed until the crowd thinned, his coffee now cold. He closed his book, left a tip folded neatly under the saucer, and stood. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, like he was measuring the weight of each step. As he passed the counter, his eyes met Emma's for a fraction of a second, long enough for her breath to hitch, not long enough to mean anything. Then he was gone, the bell marking his exit with its familiar ring. Emma stared at the empty table, her fingers still clutching the rag she'd been using. "Next Tuesday," she whispered to herself, the words half a vow, half a dare. Emma stood frozen at the counter, the rag still clutched in her hand, her whisper of "next Tuesday" hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. The bell's echo faded, but the weight of David's fleeting glance lingered, a quiet jolt that made her fingers tremble. She turned back to the coffee machine, its hiss and gurgle pulling her into the rhythm of the cafe. But her mind was already racing toward the promise she'd made. A note, a spark, a risk she wasn't sure she could take. The week crawled by, each day a slow grind of spilled cream, impatient customers, and Mr. Hensley's sharp voice barking orders from the back. Emma moved through it all, her hands steady, but her thoughts restless, circling back to table 9. By Monday, the idea of the note had grown roots, twisting through her nerves like ivy on a fence post. She wasn't a dreamer, not like Lily, who spun stories of romance like they were campfire tales. Emma's world was practical. Bills to pay, Noah's school books to buy, her mom's prescriptions to refill. But David, with his quiet eyes and untouched coffee, was a crack in that world, letting in a sliver of something wild. Tuesday morning broke cold, the New York streets slick with last night's rain. The cafe hummed with its usual chaos, the clatter of cups and the low drone of conversation blending into a familiar song. Emma tied her apron, her fingers fumbling with the knot, and caught Lily's eye across the counter. "Today's the day, cowgirl," Lily said, her grin sharp as a switchblade. "You gonna ride or run?" Emma shot her a look, half annoyed, half grateful. "Don't push me, Lil. I said I'd do it." The bell chimed at 8:47, right on schedule. David walked in, his boots leaving faint wet prints on the floor. He wore a navy jacket today, collar turned up against the chill, his hair slightly damp and curling at the edges. He moved to table 9 like it was his own patch of earth, settling in with that same, unhurried calm. Emma's heart kicked like a spooked horse, but she forced herself to keep moving, pouring coffee, clearing plates, anything to delay the moment. She wasn't ready. Not yet. The morning rush ebbed, leaving a quiet that felt like the hush before a storm. David's coffee sat steaming, his book open but unread, his gaze fixed on the window where the city blurred past. Emma watched him from behind the counter, her order pad a crumpled shield in her hand. Lily sidled up, wiping her hands on a towel. "You're stalling," she said, voice low but pointed. "Write the damn note, Emma. He's not gonna bite." Emma exhaled, sharp and shaky. "What if he doesn't even read it? Or, worse, what if he does?" Lily leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Then you'll know. Either way, you're not the girl who hides in the shadows. Go on." Emma's fingers tightened around her pen, the weight of it suddenly heavy as iron. She nodded, more to herself than to Lily, and slipped the order pad into her apron pocket. It was now or never. She poured David's refill, the coffee's dark swirl mirroring the churn in her stomach. The receipt printer spat out its slip, crisp and accusing. Emma grabbed it, her pulse hammering in her ears. She glanced at David, still staring out the window, oblivious, and then at Lily, who gave her a nod sharp enough to cut glass. Emma turned her back to the room, shielding the receipt like a secret. Her pen hovered, then scratched out the words, quick and deliberate. "You don't notice me, but you make my job more interesting." "Thanks." She stared at the ink, her handwriting small but bold, like a shout in a quiet room. It wasn't poetry, wasn't a confession, just a truth she couldn't keep inside anymore. She folded the receipt, tucking it under the saucer, her hands steadier now that the deed was done. The walk to table 9 felt like crossing a desert, each step kicking up dust in her chest. "Here's your refill," she said, setting the cup down with a careful clink. Her voice was even, professional, but her eyes darted to his face, searching for a flicker of something, anything. David looked up, his gaze steady, unreadable, like a lake too deep to see the bottom. "Thanks," he said, his voice low, a touch of gravel in it. Their eyes held for a beat, long enough for her breath to catch, then she turned away, her sneakers squeaking on the floor. Back at the counter, she busied herself with wiping down the espresso machine, her hands moving faster than necessary. Lily leaned in, whispering, "Did you do it?" Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. Her eyes flicked to table 9 where David was unfolding the receipt. His fingers paused, just for a second, as he read the note. No smile, no frown, just a stillness that made her stomach twist. He tucked the receipt into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, more than usual, she noticed, and placed them under the saucer. Then he stood, his book under one arm, and walked out, the bell's chime marking his exit like a gunshot. Emma exhaled, her shoulders sagging. "He didn't say anything," she said, more to herself than to Lily. The disappointment stung, sharp and unexpected, like a splinter under her skin. Lily shrugged, tossing her towel over her shoulder. "He read it, didn't he? And that tip wasn't chump change. Give it time, Em." But time felt like a rope slipping through her fingers, and she wasn't sure she could hold on. She turned back to the counter, the cafe's noise swallowing her thoughts. But the weight of that note, of what she'd dared to say, settled in her bones like a promise she couldn't take back. The weight of that note, now tucked in David's pocket, sat heavy in Emma's chest like a stone she'd thrown into a still pond, its ripples fading but not gone. She turned back to the counter, the cafe's clamor swallowing her thoughts. But the echo of her own daring clung to her like dust on a trail. She'd cast her line, and now she could only wait to see if it caught. The next Tuesday came sharp and brittle, the air outside the cafe carrying the bite of late fall. Emma worked her shift with a quiet focus, her hands steady as she poured coffee and wiped down tables, but her eyes kept drifting to the door. The bell stayed silent longer than usual, and by mid-morning, Table 9 sat empty, its surface gleaming under the window's pale light. Lily caught her glance and raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, her silence louder than any tease. Emma shrugged it off, busying herself with a stack of dirty mugs, but the absence of David's shadow felt like a missing chord in a song she hadn't realized she'd been humming. When the bell finally chimed at 10:13, her head snapped up. David stepped in, his coat dusted with the city's grit, his eyes scanning the room for a half-second before settling on Table 9. He carried a book, same as always, but today it was a worn copy of Lonesome Dove, its spine creased like an old map. Emma's pulse quickened, but she kept her distance, serving other tables, her movements deliberate like a ranch hand pacing a corral. She wouldn't chase him, not after the note. The ball was in his court now. He ordered his usual black coffee, his voice low and steady when she approached. "Good book?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could rein them in. David looked up, his gaze catching hers like a hook. "It's honest," he said, his voice carrying a trace of something warm, like embers under ash. "People trying to do right, even when the world's against them." Emma nodded, her fingers tightening around her order pad. "Sounds like a hard road," she said, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes holding hers a beat longer than necessary. That exchange, brief as a desert breeze, cracked open something new. Over the next few weeks, their interactions grew, small but steady, like stones marking a path. One Tuesday, when a kid spilled juice across the floor, David didn't just sit there like the other customers. He grabbed a stack of napkins from his table and handed them to Emma, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. "Accidents happen," he said, his tone matter of fact, but his eyes were soft, like he saw the weight she carried. Another day, when Mr. Hensley snapped at her for a late order, David's voice cut through the din, calm but firm. "She's doing fine," he said, not looking up from his book. "Place runs smoother because of her." The manager muttered and backed off, and Emma felt a warmth spread through her, like sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. These moments, quick and unshowy, started to stitch themselves into her days. David never lingered, never made a fuss, but he noticed things. The way she tucked a pencil behind her ear, the way she smiled at a regular's bad joke. One morning, when she dropped a tray of sugar packets, scattering them like seeds across the floor, he was there before she could kneel, gathering them up with a quiet efficiency. "You're quick on the draw," she said, half joking, and he glanced up, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Gotta be in a place like this," he replied, and for the first time, she caught a spark of humor in his voice, dry as sagebrush. Emma started to look forward to Tuesdays, not just for the notes, aftermath, but for these fleeting exchanges. They weren't grand gestures, just quiet markers, like hoofprints on a trail, showing her David wasn't as distant as he seemed. She began to notice his quirks, the way he tapped his thumb against his mug when lost in thought, the way he always left his tip folded in a precise square. Her curiosity deepened, but so did her caution. He was still a stranger, a man whose life beyond Table 9 was a blank page. Yet each small moment felt like a step closer, a bridge built one plank at a time. By late November, the cafe was strung with Christmas lights, their glow softening the room's edges. David came in, his scarf loose around his neck, and set a small bookmark on the table, a scrap of leather with a faint burn mark, like it had been salvaged from a fire. Emma, clearing a nearby table, couldn't help herself. "That's seen some miles," she said, nodding at the bookmark. He looked up, surprised, then nodded. "Belonged to my dad," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Keeps me grounded." She didn't push, didn't pry, but the weight of those words settled in her, heavy as a saddle. For the first time, she felt like she'd glimpsed the man behind the silence, and it made her want to know more. That glimpse of David's past, tethered to a worn leather bookmark, stayed with Emma like the scent of rain on dry earth, subtle but unshakable. She carried it through her shift, her hands moving mechanically as she stacked cups and swept crumbs. But her mind wandered to the man at table 9, his quiet words hinting at a story she couldn't yet read. Across town, in a glass-walled office high above the city's churn, David sat at a desk too large for one man, the skyline sprawling beyond the window like a map of his ambitions. Papers were spread before him, reports, spreadsheets, projections, but his eyes kept drifting to the folded receipt in his pocket, Emma's handwriting sharp as a brand. "You don't notice me, but you make my job more interesting. Thanks." It wasn't just the words. It was the courage behind them, raw and unpolished, like a colt breaking free of the corral. He leaned back, the leather chair creaking under his weight, and ran a hand through his hair. He was David Carter, CEO of Brood Awakening, a coffee empire built from grit and sleepless nights. But at table 9, he was just David, a man trying to outrun the shadow of his title. He hadn't meant to linger at that cafe. It started as routine, a stop on his circuit of undercover visits to check operations, to see what the numbers couldn't show. Brood Awakening had grown too fast, its soul stretched thin by corporate demands, and David needed to know if the heart of it still beat. The Maple Hill branch was just another pin on the map, until he saw Emma. She moved through the chaos like a rider guiding a herd, steady and sure, her smile a flicker of light for every customer, even the ones who didn't deserve it. He noticed the way she tucked a napkin into an old man's coat pocket, the way she laughed off Mr. Hensley's barking orders. She was the kind of person who made a place feel alive, and David, who'd spent years in boardrooms where warmth was a liability, found himself drawn back week after week, not for the coffee, but for her. He couldn't tell her who he was, not yet. The truth, his title, his wealth, would change everything, like a storm scattering a fire's embers. He'd seen it before, people's eyes shifting, their words turning careful, their kindness tinged with calculation. Emma's note had been honest, unguarded, and he wanted to keep it that way. But sitting there, staring at the city's jagged horizon, he felt the weight of his silence. Every Tuesday he spent at table 9, every small word they exchanged was a step deeper into a lie he hadn't meant to weave. His phone buzzed, pulling him back. A text from his assistant, Clara. "Maple Hill report ready. Issues with staff turnover." "Want me to schedule a review?" David typed back. "Hold off. I'll handle it myself." He'd been handling it himself for months, slipping into the cafe like a ghost, watching not just Emma, but the whole operation. The overworked baristas, the outdated register system, Hensley's heavy-handed management. He could fix it all with a memo, but that would mean stepping out of the shadows, revealing himself to Emma. And he wasn't ready for that. He stood, pacing the office, his boots clicking on the polished floor. The receipt was still in his hand, its edges soft from handling. He thought of Emma's voice, light but steady, when she'd mentioned his bookmark. "Belonged to my dad. Keeps me grounded." He hadn't meant to say that, hadn't meant to let her see even that small piece of him. His father had been a rancher, a man of few words and hard hands, gone too soon to teach David how to carry a legacy without losing himself. The bookmark was all that remained, a tether to a simpler life. Emma had seen it, and somehow she'd seen him too. If this story of quiet connections and hidden truths is stirring something in you, consider subscribing to our channel for more tales that cut through the noise. Stories of folks finding their way through life's dust and grit. Your support keeps these stories alive, and we'd love to have you along for the ride. David stopped pacing, his reflection caught in the window. He was 38, successful by every measure, but alone in ways that success couldn't fix. Emma was different. Not just her kindness, but the way she made him feel like a man, not a title. He wanted to talk to her, really talk, but every word risked unraveling the fragile thread between them. He'd kept his distance, kept his replies short, but her note had changed the game. It was a challenge, a dare, and he wasn't sure he could meet it without breaking something. He slipped the receipt back into his pocket and grabbed his coat. Next Tuesday, he'd go back. Not as the CEO, not as a ghost, but as David, the man who'd felt seen for the first time in years. He didn't know what he'd say, didn't know if he'd say anything at all. But as he stepped into the elevator, the city's lights blurring below, he felt the pull of Table 9, strong as a river's current, and he knew he couldn't stay away. The pull of Table 9, strong as a river's current, carried David back to the cafe, but the weight of his unspoken truth pressed harder with every step. He rode the elevator down from his office, the city's lights fading behind him, and steeled himself for another Tuesday, knowing each moment with Emma deepened a secret he couldn't keep forever. The cafe was quieter that morning, the air thick with the scent of cinnamon and brewing coffee, the Christmas lights casting a soft glow across the worn wooden tables. Emma moved through her shift with her usual rhythm, but there was a new edge to her, sharper, bolder, like a horse testing the reins. She'd felt the shift in their exchanges, the way David's small gestures had woven a fragile thread between them. When he walked in at 8:50, his coat flecked with snow, she caught his eye and offered a half smile, quick as a spark. He nodded, settling at Table 9, but his fingers lingered on the edge of his book, restless, like he was holding something back. Emma didn't know the storm brewing beneath his calm. She served his coffee, their fingers brushing as she set the cup down, and for a moment, the cafe's noise fell away. "Cold out there," she said, her voice light but probing. "You ever stay long enough to warm up?" David's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Working on it," he said, his voice low, like a wind stirring dust across a plain. She lingered a second longer than necessary, then turned back to the counter, her heart kicking up a notch. She didn't see the way his eyes followed her, heavy with a truth he couldn't yet speak. That night, alone in her small apartment, Emma sat cross-legged on her bed, the glow of her phone cutting through the dark. Noah was asleep in the next room, his textbooks scattered on the floor, and her mom's cough echoed faintly down the hall. She scrolled through her messages, then, on a whim, opened a browser and typed, "David, New York, coffee." It was a half-hearted search, born of curiosity and sleeplessness, but the results hit like a thunderclap. A photo from a business conference, 3 months old, showed a man in a tailored suit, his posture unmistakable, his eyes the same ones she'd met across Table 9. "David Carter, CEO of Brood Awakening," the caption read. Her breath caught, sharp as a blade. The man she'd written a note to, the man who'd handed her napkins and spoken up for her, wasn't just a quiet stranger. He was a millionaire, a power broker, playing a part in her cafe. The room spun, the phone slipping from her hand. She felt like she'd been thrown from a horse, the ground rushing up to meet her. Every moment, the bookmark, the folded tips, the way he'd looked at her, felt like a lie, a carefully spun web. She pressed her palms to her eyes, willing her heart to slow, but the betrayal burned, raw and relentless. Had he been watching her like a project, a case study for his empire? Was her note just a game to him, a story to laugh about in his high-rise office? Next Tuesday, Emma walked into the cafe with her jaw set tight, her apron tied like armor. The bell chimed at 8:47, and there he was, same coat, same table, same book. But now she saw him differently. His calm, no longer quiet, but calculated. His presence a mask. She didn't approach him, letting Lily take his order instead. David's eyes followed her, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. But she kept her distance, her hands busy with tasks that didn't need doing. Mid-shift, she couldn't hold it in any longer. She strode to table 9, her boots heavy on the floor, and stopped in front of him, arms crossed. "You're David Carter," she said, her voice low but sharp as barbed wire. "CEO. Why didn't you tell me?" The cafe's hum faded, heads turning. But Emma didn't care. David's face stilled, his book closing with a soft thud. "Emma," he started, his voice careful, like he was stepping through a minefield. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it?" she snapped, her eyes blazing. "You sat here week after week letting me think you were just you. Was I a joke to you? Some experiment?" Her voice cracked, betraying the hurt she'd tried to bury. David stood, his hands raised slightly, palms open. "No," he said, his voice steady but raw. "I didn't tell you because I wanted you to see me, not the title. I wanted it to be real." Emma shook her head, her throat tight. "Real? You don't get to decide what's real for me." She turned, walking back to the counter, her boots echoing like gunshots. David stayed rooted, his eyes on her back, the weight of her words heavier than any boardroom loss. She worked the rest of her shift in silence, her movements mechanical, her heart a tangled knot. The cafe's warmth felt mocking now, its lights too bright. When David left, his coffee untouched, he didn't look back. Emma watched the door close, the bell's chime cutting through her like a cold wind. She'd wanted truth, and now she had it, but it felt like a wound that wouldn't close. The bell's chime faded, leaving Emma staring at the closed door, the wound of David's deception raw as a fresh brand on her heart. She turned back to the counter, her boots heavy, the cafe's warmth now a mockery of the trust she'd lost. She'd wanted truth, and it had cut her deep, leaving her to wonder if anything between them had been real. Days bled into weeks, the cafe's rhythm unchanged but hollow. Emma moved through her shifts like a rider on a worn trail, her hands steady, but her eyes distant. Table 9 stayed empty most Tuesdays, David's absence a silent echo of their confrontation. When he did appear, he was quieter, his gaze avoiding hers, his coffee left untouched. Emma kept her distance, her apron a shield, her words clipped and professional. Lily tried to coax her back to her old spark, but Emma's smiles were thin, like sagebrush in a drought. She couldn't shake the betrayal, the way David's lie had turned her small moments of courage into something fragile, breakable. At home, life pressed harder. Noah's school fees were due, and her mom's cough worsened, each hack a reminder of bills piling up like dry timber. Emma sat up late, balancing numbers on a scratched-up notebook, her pen digging into the paper. She didn't notice the subtle shifts at first. A landlord's offhand comment about a repaired leak in their apartment's bathroom. A letter from Noah's school about a community grant covering his tuition for the semester. When she pressed for details, the answers were vague. "Some fella took care of it," her landlord said, shrugging. "Said it was owed to you." Emma's brow furrowed, suspicion stirring like dust on a windless plain. But she had no proof, no name to pin it to. Across town, David sat in his office, the city's lights a cold glow against the night. He hadn't returned to the cafe to play the stranger again. That game was over. But he couldn't let go of Emma, not entirely. Her words, "You don't get to decide what's real for me," had carved into him, sharp as a spur. He'd wanted to be seen, but he'd built a wall instead. Now, he worked in the shadows, not as a CEO, but as a man trying to mend what he'd broken. He made calls, quiet ones, to contacts who could move money without leaving tracks. A scholarship fund for Noah, routed through a local nonprofit. A discreet payment to Emma's landlord for overdue repairs. A donation to the clinic covering her mom's medication, no questions asked. He didn't want credit, didn't want gratitude. He just wanted her world to feel a little less heavy, even if she never knew why. Emma began to notice the changes, small at first, then undeniable. A new inhaler appeared in her mom's purse, no bill attached. Noah came home grinning, talking about a science camp he'd been accepted to, fully funded. Each discovery hit Emma like a pebble in a still pond, rippling through her anger. She sat on her bed one night, staring at the ceiling, her mind tracing back to David. No one else had the means, the motive. But why? If he'd lied to her, why go to such lengths now, without a word? She saw him again on a gray Tuesday, the cafe half empty, the air thick with the scent of burnt coffee. He sat at table 9, his coat folded over the chair, his book unopened. Emma's chest tightened, but she didn't approach. Instead, she watched him from the counter, her hands gripping a rag like a lifeline. He looked different. Tired, maybe, his shoulders carrying a weight she hadn't noticed before. When he left, his tip was smaller, not showy, just enough to blend in. But tucked under the saucer was a folded note, not a receipt but a scrap of paper. She hesitated, then unfolded it. "I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." No signature, no explanation, just those words, stark as a lone tree on a prairie. Emma's breath caught, her fingers trembling. The note wasn't an answer, but it was a gesture, raw and unadorned. She slipped it into her pocket, her heart a tangle of anger and something softer, unnamed. She didn't know if she could forgive him, didn't know if she wanted to. But as she wiped down the counter, the note's weight pressed against her, a quiet challenge. David wasn't at table 9 anymore, but his presence lingered, like the shadow of a hawk circling overhead. Emma looked out the window, the city's blur reflecting her own uncertainty, and wondered if some truths could be mended, not with words, but with time. Emma stared out the cafe window, the city's blur a mirror to her tangled heart. David's note. "I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you," a quiet weight in her pocket, like a stone smoothed by a river's patient flow. She didn't know if she could forgive him, but the question lingered, sharp as a spur, nudging her toward a choice she wasn't ready to make. Winter tightened its grip on New York, the streets dusted with snow that turned to slush underfoot. Emma's shifts at the cafe dragged, each day a slog through routine, but the weight of David's unseen gestures, Noah's tuition, her mom's medicine, shifted something in her. She couldn't prove it was him, but the coincidence cut too deep to ignore. One evening, after closing, she sat with Lily at a corner table, the cafe dark except for a single bulb flickering above. "He's trying," Lily said, her voice soft but firm, like a friend calling a bluff. "Maybe not with words, but he's out there doing something. You gonna let that go to waste?" Emma traced a crack in the table, her fingers restless. "I don't know what to do with it," she admitted, her voice low, like a wind rustling through dry grass. She didn't see David for weeks, his absence a shadow that both stung and soothed. Then, one icy morning, a note arrived, slipped under the cafe's door before opening. No signature, just a scrawled invitation. Coffee at the Rusty Spur, 3 p.m. Saturday. No pressure, just a chance to talk. The Rusty Spur was a small joint across town, far from Maple Hill's bustle, its walls lined with old saddles and faded photos. Emma stared at the note, her pulse kicking like a Mustang. She could ignore it, let the silence grow, but something in her, curiosity maybe, or the faint pull of those small moments at table 9, made her fold it into her pocket. Saturday came, the sky heavy with clouds. Emma walked into the Rusty Spur, her boots scuffing the worn floorboards, the air thick with the scent of dark roast and leather. David sat in a corner booth, no book, no coat, just a plain flannel shirt and a mug he wasn't drinking from. His eyes met hers, steady but unguarded, like a man laying down his cards. She slid into the seat across from him, her hands clasped tight to keep them still. "You got 5 minutes," she said, her voice sharp but not cold. "Talk." David leaned forward, his hands loose on the table, like a cowboy sizing up a long trail. "I messed up," he said, his voice low, rough as gravel. "I hid who I was because I thought it'd keep things real. But I hurt you, and I'll carry that." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I didn't come to the cafe to play games. I came for work, but I stayed for you. Your kindness, your grit. It reminded me there's still good in the world." Emma's throat tightened, but she held his gaze, her silence a challenge. They talked, haltingly at first, about neutral things. Books, the city's winter bite, the way coffee tasted better in a quiet place. David didn't push, didn't apologize again, just listened when she spoke, his attention steady as a horizon line. She told him about Noah's excitement for science camp, her mom's better days, her own dreams of designing spaces that felt like home. He nodded, asking questions that showed he'd been paying attention, not just now, but all those Tuesdays. "You see people," he said once, almost to himself. "That's rare." Emma didn't reply, but the words settled in her, soft as dust after a storm. They met again the next week, then the week after. Always at the Rusty Spur, never at Maple Hill. Each conversation chipped away at the wall between them, not with grand gestures but with honesty, plain as a well-worn saddle. David shared fragments of his own life, his father's ranch, lost to debt, the pressure of a company that felt more like a cage than a crown. Emma listened, her anger thawing, replaced by a cautious warmth, like a fire rekindled from dying embers. One evening, as snow fell outside, Emma looked at him across the booth, his face lit by the dim glow of a lantern. "Why keep helping us?" she asked, her voice steady but searching. "You didn't have to." David's fingers paused on his mug, his eyes meeting hers. "Because you deserve a world that doesn't weigh you down," he said, simple as a prayer. "And I wanted to be part of that, even if you never spoke to me again." Emma's breath hitched, her heart caught between trust and fear, like a horse at the edge of a canyon. She didn't forgive him, not fully, but she felt the ground shift beneath her, a new path opening where none had been before. Emma felt the ground shift beneath her, a new path opening like a trail cutting through a canyon's heart. David's words, "You deserve a world that doesn't weigh you down," still echoing in her mind. She left the Rusty Spur that snowy evening, her boots crunching on the sidewalk, her heart lighter but still wary, like a horse stepping cautiously over unfamiliar terrain. Spring crept into New York, softening the city's edges with pale green buds and longer days. Emma no longer worked at Maple Hill. She'd left after one too many shifts under Mr. Hensley's glare, trading the cafe's clatter for a part-time gig at a local design studio. It was small, unpaid at first, but it let her sketch room layouts, furniture placements, spaces that felt like home. A letter had arrived weeks earlier, offering a scholarship to a design institute, with no sender named. Emma knew it was David's doing, though he never admitted it. She didn't ask, didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than any confession, steady as a river-carving stone. They kept meeting at the Rusty Spur, their conversations growing easier, like a rope slowly unknotted. David didn't push, didn't crowd her, just showed up with his quiet presence, his stories of a life beyond the CEO's desk. Nights spent reading by a Wyoming campfire, mornings mending fences with his father before the ranch was lost. Emma shared her own dreams, her sketches of cozy lofts and open kitchens, her hope to build places where people felt seen. One afternoon, as they walked through a park, the city's noise fading behind budding trees, David stopped, his hands in his pockets. "You're building something real," he said, his voice low, like a breeze over a prairie. "I just want to be there to see it." Emma met his eyes, her guard softening, and nodded, a silent agreement to let him try. Months passed, each meeting a step closer, their connection rebuilt on truth, not shadows. David arranged for Noah's science camp to extend through summer, anonymous as always. And when Emma's mom received a new wheelchair, lighter and easier to maneuver, the clinic mentioned a donor who asked for no thanks. Emma's gratitude grew, not for the gifts, but for the man who gave without expecting her to bend. She started to see him again, not the CEO, not the liar, but David, the man who listened when she spoke, who laughed at her dry humor, who carried his own scars with the same quiet strength she'd once admired at Table 9. One evening, Emma stood in the design studio, her sketches spread across a table, each line a piece of her vision. A local artist had hired her to design a gallery space for an upcoming exhibition, her first real project. She poured herself into it, choosing warm woods and soft lighting, creating a space that invited lingering. The night of the opening, the gallery buzzed with voices, the air rich with paint and possibility. Emma stood by her work, her hands clasped tight, her heart racing like a colt before a race. The crowd praised her, their words of validation she'd never dared hope for. She'd caught her dream, shaped it with her own hands, and it felt like standing on solid ground after years of shifting sand. David arrived late, slipping in quietly, his flannel shirt out of place among the city's sleek suits. He didn't approach her, just stood by a wall, watching her move through the crowd, his eyes soft with pride. When the guests thinned, he walked over, his boots scuffing the polished floor. "This is you," he said, nodding at the room. "Every inch of it." Emma smiled, her chest warm, and for the first time, she reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his, steady as a vow. Weeks later, she came home to find a folded receipt on her kitchen table. No coffee order, just David's handwriting. "Still here, Emma. Marry me." Her breath caught, her eyes stinging as she laughed, the sound raw and free. David stepped from the kitchen, his hands in his pockets, his gaze steady but hopeful, like a man waiting for a storm to pass. She didn't speak, didn't need to. She crossed the room, her arms wrapping around him, her answer pressed into the quiet of his embrace. Their wedding was small, held in a garden Emma had designed, its paths lined with wildflowers, its air heavy with lavender. Noah grinned from the front row, her mom's eyes bright with tears. As Emma walked toward David, her dress simple, her boots scuffed, the world narrowed to his face, his smile a horizon she'd always chase. They spoke vows plain as earth, promising not perfection but presence, not wealth but truth. The crowd faded, and in that moment, under a sky wide as a prairie, they built a future not on secrets, but on the courage to start again. Emma and David's journey, from a scribbled note to a garden vow, reminds us that love can rise from broken trust, built on quiet courage and honest time. We hope their story stirred your heart, showing how small moments can carve a lasting path. Please share your thoughts and rate this tale from 0 to 10 in the comments, letting us know where you're joining us from. Thank you for listening. We look forward to sharing more stories that linger like dust on a trail. See you soon.